The year was 1905, and the land of Louisiana was covered in endless swamps where progress had not fully arrived, and the world beyond seemed like a distant rumor. In the outer edges of Shreveport, the air was heavy with silence, broken only by whispers. That something unnatural was unfolding deep within the wetlands. Families who traveled the rough trails vanished without explanation. Wagons stood abandoned in clearings. Horses trembled with their harnesses still tied, yet no trace of men, women, or children was ever found. It appeared as though the ground itself had swallowed them whole. But the truth that would later emerge was far more terrifying than anything local minds could imagine. At the center of this darkness stood the Broussard clan, a family whose name would become forever linked with the most disturbing tale of cannibalism and inbreeding ever recorded in Louisiana. Tell me where you are watching from, and if this is your first visit, do subscribe, because more stories darker than any fiction await. The Broussard homestead lay buried within miles of swampy land, and could only be reached by rough, muddy tracks. Generations had passed since the property had first been claimed, and in those decades, the family built their own world away from outsiders. What seemed like a forgotten farm was actually a hidden community where 14 people lived by their own rules. Their world was bound by blood ties twisted through constant unions between brothers, sisters, cousins, and even parents with children. The matriarch Cléose Broussard, now 75, ruled with the same iron presence she had carried for decades. Small in body but fierce in gaze, she never released authority from her fragile hands. The air around her was said to carry a strange smell that even neighbors could never identify. At her side stood her son Alst Broussard, aged 42, a tall, narrow man whose eyes sank deep into his skull and whose words came out as a rasp closer to a growl than human voice. His half-sister Cordelia, aged 38, commanded the women and younger children with equal force. Cold and cunning, she shaped obedience through intimidation that required no raised hand. Boggart, a massive silent figure of 35, cast a shadow over every visitor, while Magnolia, aged 29, followed Cléose with obsessive devotion, repeating her commands like sacred scripture. The younger tier of the household included Eulalie, aged 25, who occasionally appeared in villages trading bundles of salted meat for supplies. Udro, aged 21, joined the hunts and rarely spoke beyond gestures. But it was the sight of their children that unsettled strangers most. Thibodeau, aged 16, Celeste, aged 14, Octave, aged 12, Sidonie, aged 10, the twins Alpha and Anatole, only 8, and little Azélie, merely 6, spoke among themselves in an old French tongue, lost even to elder locals. Their behavior was eerie, disciplined, and filled with an obedience that felt unnatural. Around them the family grounds stretched across several acres. A large wooden house under a rusted zinc roof housed adults and older children. Scattered cabins and sheds surrounded it, added without planning by each generation. Yet, despite the presence of 14 souls, the land was always unnervingly silent. No laughter, no arguments, no casual chatter. Each member worked like a cog in a quiet machine that required no words. Outsiders would later realize this silence was not born of harmony, but of ritual. In the winter of 19, one change was first noticed. The Broussards suddenly appeared healthier. Their clothing improved. Their children looked better fed. From 1902, merchants noticed that their visits became regular. Each week, they arrived with sacks of salted meat in amounts that no isolated family could gather. The cuts were clean, uniform, and wrapped neatly in cloth. When asked what animal had supplied such abundance, the reply was always swamp game. But those who examined the meat found something unusual. Its flesh was lighter than deer, softer than boar, and carried a smell that stirred unease. Each time a merchant inhaled it, set nausea crept into his stomach. Still, the trade continued, because the family offered fair prices and seemed desperate for supplies. Yet suspicions grew. The Broussard children, when near butcher counters, leaned close to sniff the meat like predators testing prey. Their disappointment after smelling was clear, as though comparing it with something they found superior. By 1902, the local priest, Father Gilbert Horton, attempted several times to visit the family to provide blessings. Each time Alst appeared at the edge of the land-blocking entrance with stern refusal. In the shadows behind him, Father Horton counted figures moving, eyes watching from cracks between boards, silhouettes shifting behind sheds. He recorded in his journal that never once did he see fewer than 12 people watching from the dark. He left with an unease that weighed heavy on his conscience. As the months passed, whispers spread through the region. During cold nights, hunters noticed strange fires flickering in the swamp, peculiar smells drifting on the wind, sounds that were neither human nor animal. People began to wonder if the missing travelers had crossed paths with something terrible, hiding in the wetlands. The first confirmed disappearance came in March 1902, when the Morrison family set out from Shreveport toward a sawmill community. Days later, their wagon was discovered abandoned near the Broussard property. Horses trembled nearby, belongings untouched, no blood, no footprints, no sign of struggle. 5 people had evaporated into nothingness. Sheriff Augustus Landry, a man seasoned by 20 years of dealing with crime, admitted in his records that never had he encountered such a mystery. Within weeks, another family, the Thiebaus, vanished under identical circumstances. Their wagon, too, stood abandoned, possessions intact, owners gone. By the end of that year, 6 families had vanished, always along the same roads, always leaving wagons and goods behind. Fear spread like sickness. By 1903, 12 more families disappeared. Merchants abandoned routes, preferring dangerous detours rather than risk the swamp trails. Parents forbade children from traveling. At the same time, Father Horton noticed unsettling changes among the Broussards. Sometimes many shadows moved across the land, other times the farm appeared empty. Children arriving in town walked in strict formation, under adult supervision, disciplined far beyond normal youth. They hid their true nature behind an obedient mask. In his diary, the priest wrote of satisfaction in their eyes that had never been present before. It was as if they had found a new source of joy. He also observed their fixation with meat. They approached butcher stalls not with curiosity, but with an intimate knowledge, as though evaluating cuts like professionals. Merchants confessed to the priest that the children whispered in archaic French about quality and seasoning, as though reviewing their own craft. The pattern of disappearances never slowed. 10 more families vanished in 1904. Panic seized communities. Travelers formed groups, refusing to cross roads alone. Roads near the Broussard land grew empty. Yet the family continued trading salted meat more than ever before. After each disappearance, Father Horton noted, the Broussard farm would fall, silent for days before smoke rose from multiple chimneys and wagons carried new loads of meat into town. Merchants began to realize the visits coincided too perfectly with the vanishings. It was not coincidence. Something sinister tied them together. By 1905, fear had turned into dread. 6 more families were gone in just months. Entire communities withdrew, commerce halted, and the swamp became a forbidden zone. Father Horton decided he could no longer remain a passive observer. In August 1905, he followed a stench carried on humid winds. It was sweet, foul, heavier than death. He discovered soil washed by rains, revealing torn garments, shoes of children, fragments of jewelry, even teeth mixed with mud. He wrote in his diary that night that his soul could no longer deny the truth. He mapped wagon locations and saw they all formed a circle around the Broussard land. He marked the silence that always followed a disappearance and the sudden sale of meat days later. When he presented his findings to Sheriff Landry, the lawman examined the rag doll stained with old blood that the priest had recovered. He recognized the fabric from a dress worn by a child who had disappeared years earlier. The sheriff gathered deputies and hunting dogs to search the area. Almost immediately, dogs barked and clawed at soft ground. In hours, an acre of swamp yielded hundreds of personal belongings: boots, dresses, children's toys, Bibles, combs, torn spectacles. Digging deeper uncovered bones. Human bones of men, women, and children mixed with animal remains. Many bore marks of knives and saws, flesh removed. With precision, Dr. Rodney Manning, the local physician, concluded the cuts were done by hands experienced in butchery. It was professional, systematic, and horrifying. The swamp had preserved evidence of mass slaughter. Sheriff Landry recorded his sickness at the realization this was not isolated murder, but industrial cannibalism operating undetected for 4 years. They resolved to confront the Broussards at once. When deputies surrounded the homestead, they discovered sheds that resembled slaughterhouses. Wooden tables bore dark stains, knives and saws lined the walls, metal hooks hung in rows, barrels of salt-filled storerooms. Meat racks stretched across shelves, labeled with crude French notes identifying type, age, and preparation. Pits filled with bones revealed a scale of horror beyond imagination. As the lawmen closed in, chaos erupted. Figures darted into swamps. Shouts in archaic French filled the air. Children and adults scattered along hidden trails. Only some were captured: Cleos, Cordelia, and 5 children including Octave, Sidonie, the twins Alf and Anatole, and little Azeli. Others, including Elst, Eulalie, Budrow, Boggart, Magnolia, Thibodeau, and Celeste, melted into the swamp's depths. Inside the main house, deputies found journals in which Cleos had documented each victim, describing taste, preparation, and even evaluation of meat quality. Trophies of victims filled a cabin, from clothes to jewelry to toys. Children's drawings, portrait hunts, and butcher scenes, as though they were ordinary play. Dr. Manning later described it as the most organized cannibal system ever uncovered. Interrogations began. Cleos, at 75, sat with eyes filled with disdain and spoke without shame. She insisted that they had done nothing wrong, only perfected old traditions for survival. She likened their work to farming and butchering, confused by accusations of crime. Cordelia echoed her mother with equal coldness, describing techniques of preservation as though teaching culinary science. The children, examined by Dr. Manning, showed deformities from generations of inbreeding and spoke with chilling normality about eating human flesh. They obeyed Cleos and Cordelia without hesitation, reacting like trained soldiers to even whispered commands. When asked about food, they explained it was better than butcher meat because they knew its source and preparation. Octave reasoned that humans were animals too, so meat was meat. Their words revealed minds molded from birth to accept horror as life. Sheriff Landry wrote that questioning them shattered his belief in innocence. The Broussards had killed 42 people in 4 years, an average of more than 10 each year. They consumed part, salted part, and sold the rest disguised as game. They saw their operation not as crime, but as success. Cleos even described it as a family business sustained by intelligence and efficiency. Cordelia detailed categories of meat by age, gender, and occupation, claiming some victims produced tenderer flesh than others. The children confirmed preferences with unsettling clarity, discussing flavor and texture as though reviewing meals. Investigators realized they were confronting not madness, but a structured, alternative morality where cannibalism was normalized. When pressed, Cleos confessed their tradition, stretched back to her grandfather, who once survived winter by consuming a dead traveler. Over generations, it had evolved from occasional necessity to permanent system. In 1902, with 14 mouths to feed, she envisioned expansion. By 1903, they operated with industrial order. By 1904 and 1905, they reached perfection, selling meat in bulk, storing supplies, and planning future branches beyond Louisiana. She called it a vision of survival. Her phrase, recorded during questioning, chilled all present. Meat is meat, family is family, and business is business. This was no accidental evil, but deliberate design. The trial of the Broussard family began in Shreveport, inside a crowded courthouse where onlookers filled every corner, desperate to understand how an entire household had turned into a system of murder and cannibalism. Reporters came from across the country, and families of the vanished sat in silence, faces pale, as the details emerged. At the center sat Cleos Broussard, 75 years old, frail in body, but unwavering in expression. She carried herself not like a criminal, but like a woman defending a business. When the charges were read, 42 murders, systematic cannibalism, and organized crime, she listened with indifference, as if hearing a list of chores. Cordelia sat nearby with the same cold pride, correcting prosecutors when they described technical details of butchery incorrectly, almost teaching them about precision in human meat preparation. The 5 children captured Octave, Sidonie, twins Alf and Anatole, and Azélie were held separately while doctors debated their fate. Witnesses reported that the courtroom grew colder each time Cleo spoke. She compared her actions to farmers killing livestock, insisting she had only fed her family. She showed no remorse, even when asked about the deaths of 16 children among the victims. Instead, she expressed frustration that outsiders did not understand survival in isolation. Cordelia reinforced her words, speaking of seasoning, preservation, and sales as though explaining a recipe. Journalists described the proceedings as more disturbing than any nightmare, because the women displayed logic, not madness. Dr. Manning presented his examinations of the children. They carried visible deformities from generations of inbreeding: uneven jaws, irregular teeth, speech problems, and mental delays. Worse than the physical marks was their conditioned obedience. At a whisper from Cleos or Cordelia, they froze, in total silence, awaiting commands. They spoke of eating human flesh as normal life, unable to understand why it was forbidden. Octave described kinship in tangled ways, calling one woman his grandmother-mother and another his aunt-sister, proof of a lineage where boundaries had vanished. Manning traced records, revealing 4 generations of incest that had erased any traditional sense of family. In court, Cleos defended this heritage with pride, calling it pure blood. She argued that outsiders corrupted traditions while they preserved theirs. Evidence piled high. Journals listed victims with details of age, cuts of flesh, and taste comparisons. Trophies of toys and clothes were presented. Sheds were described as slaughterhouses with hooks, saws, and racks of salted flesh. Pits filled with bones showed the scope of horror. Witnesses testified about meat sales, strange smells, and children sniffing butcher stalls. Prosecutors painted the picture of an industrial machine hidden in swamps, operating with chilling efficiency. The jury heard everything in stunned silence. When the verdict was delivered, Cleos received the death sentence by hanging. Cordelia was sentenced to life imprisonment. The children were declared victims of conditioning, yet recognized as participants. Courts ordered them into orphanages under religious supervision to attempt reformation. Cleos met her fate in December 1905 on a cold, rainy morning. Witnesses recorded that she held her head high with superiority until the end. Her final words chilled the crowd, predicting that when other families faced true need, they would understand her methods. A rope tightened and her body fell, but her words lingered. Cordelia entered prison where she refused all meat except human. She survived on bread and vegetables, wasting away until she died in 1907 of lung infection. Still proud of her work, the children were separated. Octave, the oldest, never abandoned his conditioning. He often asked when he could return to the family's work. At 19, he died of infection caused by self-inflicted wounds, still obsessed with his lost home. Sidoni lived until 23, constantly moved between orphanages due to disturbing attempts to convince other children to taste raw meat. She perished during the Spanish flu epidemic. The twins Alf and Anatole proved uncontrollable. Violence followed them until one stabbed a supervisor and died at 15, while the other was sent to an asylum where he survived until 20, still dreaming of swamp life. Only little Azalea managed partial adaptation. She was adopted at 13 under a new identity and lived a hidden normal life, marrying, raising children, and dying in 1954. She never spoke of her past. Meanwhile, 7 members had escaped into the swamp during the raid. Alst, Eulalie Budrow, Boggard, Magnolia, Thibodeau, and Celeste vanished into the wilderness. Hunters reported seeing skeletal figures moving among cypress shadows, but capture never came. Remains of a campfire with human bones suggested they turned on strangers, or perhaps each other. Torn, bloody clothes identified as belonging to Eulalie and Magnolia confirmed violent struggle among them. Authorities concluded they likely did not survive the winter, consumed by starvation or internal conflict. Sheriff Landry recorded that without the iron control of Cleo's, their structure collapsed. In 1906, the state burned the property. Flames raged for 5 days, fueled by fat soaked into the soil after years of butchery. Smoke carried a stench that clung to air for miles. Locals avoided the area forever after. Floods in 1907 and 1908 revealed more bones, toys and clothes from the earth, as though the swamp itself refused to keep the secret buried. Father Horton, broken by his discovery, left the state. In his final writings, he confessed he had seen how men could become monsters, not through possession, but through choice, isolation, and tradition. Dr. Manning studied the case for years, publishing papers on the effects of inbreeding and isolation on morality. Sheriff Landry strengthened patrols and protocols for isolated communities. Yet none of these efforts could erase the stain of what was uncovered. The legacy of the Broussards carried into legend. Roads remained abandoned, families remembered the disappearances, and hunters claimed the swamp carried whispers of children crying. The most haunting truth was not that the Broussards were demons, but that they were human. No curse, no spirits, no supernatural powers had shaped them. Isolation, incest, hunger, and ruthless logic had molded a clan into an industrial system of cannibalism. 42 lives ended to feed 14 year after year. They operated with chilling order, documenting recipes, assigning roles, training children, and planning expansion. What had begun as survival became enterprise. The question that haunted investigators was chilling in its simplicity. If children grow in an environment where cannibalism is normal and rewarded, are they guilty or simply shaped? For the Broussards, killing and eating was no different than farming. They turned necessity into industry. Their downfall showed how quickly morality can be bent when families live without external influence. In the silence of the swamp, the story warns that true monsters are not mythical creatures, but people who lose connection with humanity. Anyone cut off long enough might invent their own morality, and under pressure, even the unthinkable can become business. If this story disturbed you, and you want to uncover more histories that prove reality can surpass horror fiction, subscribe now and activate the bell because many more chilling tales are waiting. Darkness hides countless secrets, and the Broussard legend is only one among them.